Imagine a weapon so revolutionary in its simplicity and reliability that it changed warfare forever. Picture this: a frozen testing ground somewhere in the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, 1974. The temperature has plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Snow swirls through the air like razor-sharp crystals. A group of soldiers stands in formation, their breath forming white clouds that dissipate instantly in the biting wind. In their gloved hands they hold rifles that gleam dully under the gray sky, weapons that will soon become legendary. An officer barks a command. The soldiers raise their rifles. Then, cutting through the howling wind, comes a sound that would echo across decades: the sharp, unmistakable crack of automatic fire. Round after round tears through the frigid air. The rifles don't jam. They don't freeze. They simply work. This is not just a story about a gun. This is the untold tale of human ingenuity forged in the crucible of war, refined through countless failures, and perfected by a man who understood that survival often depends on what you can hold in your hands when everything else falls apart. This is the story of the AK-74, a masterpiece born from necessity, a weapon that would redefine modern warfare and become one of the most influential firearms ever created. The world in 1945 was broken. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And as the dust settled over the battlefields of World War II, military strategists across the globe sat in their war rooms, analyzing what had just transpired. They pored over after-action reports, studied casualty figures, and reached a unanimous conclusion: warfare had fundamentally changed. The battles of World War II had revealed something crucial. Most infantry combat didn't occur at the distances military rifles had been designed for. Soldiers weren't engaging enemies at 800 meters with carefully aimed shots. They were fighting in forests, in cities, in trenches, at ranges of 300 meters or less. They needed something different. Something that could deliver sustained, accurate fire at close to medium range. Something lighter, more maneuverable, more adaptable to the chaos of modern combat. In the West, this realization sparked what would become known as the Intermediate Cartridge Revolution. The Germans had already experimented with this concept during the war with their Sturmgewehr 44, firing a shorter, lighter round that offered a perfect balance between rifle power and submachine gun controllability. The concept was sound, almost prophetic. But Germany had lost the war, and their innovations were scattered across occupied territories, waiting to be discovered, analyzed, and reimagined. The United States initially resisted this trend. American military doctrine, deeply rooted in the marksmanship traditions of World War I, favored powerful, long-range cartridges. The M14 rifle, adopted in 1957, embodied this philosophy: a full-power battle rifle that could reach out and touch targets at extended ranges. But Vietnam would prove this approach problematic. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, soldiers needed something lighter, something that allowed them to carry more ammunition, something that could engage multiple targets quickly in close-quarters combat. Meanwhile, behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union had already embraced the intermediate cartridge concept. By 1949, they had adopted the AK-47, chambered in 7.62 by 39 mm. It was revolutionary, simple, robust, devastatingly effective. Soviet soldiers could maintain it with minimal training. It functioned flawlessly in mud, sand, snow, and rain, and it could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. For 2 decades, the AK-47 reigned supreme. But by the late 1960s, the Soviets noticed something disturbing. The Americans, having learned hard lessons in Vietnam, had fully committed to the M16 rifle and its tiny 5.56 mm cartridge. This new weapon allowed soldiers to carry dramatically more ammunition. Its light recoil meant faster follow-up shots and better control during automatic fire. Reports from the battlefield suggested it was changing tactical dynamics. The Soviet military establishment couldn't ignore this development. If the West was moving towards smaller calibers, there must be valid reasons. Competition during the Cold War wasn't just about nuclear arsenals and space programs. It extended to every rifle carried by every soldier on every potential battlefield. The arms race was real, immediate, and deadly serious. The stage was set for the next evolution in Soviet small arms development. The stage was set for the AK-74. To understand the AK-74, you must first understand the man behind it. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was not born into privilege. He entered the world on November 10, 1919, in the village of Kuria in the Altai Krai region of Russia. His family were peasants, his childhood marked by hardship. When he was just 12 years old, his family was labeled as kulaks, prosperous peasants, and deported to Siberia during Stalin's brutal collectivization campaigns. Siberia could have crushed him. Instead, it forged him. Young Mikhail developed an instinctive understanding of machinery, teaching himself mechanics and engineering through observation, experimentation, and sheer determination. By the time he was conscripted into the Red Army in 1938, he had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to improve equipment, to see solutions where others saw only problems. When Operation Barbarossa shattered the peace in June 1941, Kalashnikov was serving as a tank commander. Picture him there, inside a Soviet T-34 tank, steel walls around him, the smell of diesel fuel and gun oil filling his nostrils, the deafening roar of battle outside. Then, in October 1941, during the defense of Bryansk, his world exploded. German shells found his tank. Shrapnel tore through metal and flesh. Kalashnikov was gravely wounded, his shoulder shattered, his body broken. During his long, painful recovery in a military hospital, something crystallized in his mind. He had witnessed Soviet soldiers struggling with their weapons, rifles that jammed, that were too long for tank crews, that couldn't match the firepower of German submachine guns in close combat. As he lay in that hospital bed, morphine dulling the pain but not his thoughts, he began sketching designs. His hands, still bandaged, moved across paper, drawing mechanisms, imagining solutions. If you're fascinated by groundbreaking engineering and the individuals whose innovations changed history, subscribe to this channel for more stories of invention born from necessity, refined through adversity, and perfected through unwavering dedication. Necessity truly is the mother of invention, and for Kalashnikov, necessity wore the face of war. He wasn't a formally trained engineer. He hadn't studied at prestigious universities or apprenticed under master gunsmiths. He was a soldier who understood what soldiers needed because he had been there, in the mud and blood, where theory met brutal reality. After the war, Kalashnikov continued developing his designs at a small arms research facility. His approach was fundamentally different from many of his competitors. Where they sought complexity and precision, he pursued simplicity and reliability. Where they designed for ideal conditions, he designed for the worst possible scenarios. His rifle would work when it was dirty, when it was wet, when it was frozen, when the soldier operating it was exhausted, terrified, and barely trained. This philosophy would guide all his work. By 1947, his AK-47 design had won the Soviet military's competition for a new service rifle. He was awarded the Stalin Prize and became a national hero. But Kalashnikov didn't rest. He understood that evolution was constant, that complacency was dangerous. When the Soviet military began exploring smaller caliber ammunition in the late 1960s, it was natural they would turn to him. The master would create again. The mandate came down from Soviet High Command in 1967: develop a new cartridge and a new rifle to fire it. The specifications were precise yet challenging. The new round needed to be lighter than the existing 7.62mm cartridge, allowing soldiers to carry more ammunition. It needed to have flatter trajectory for improved accuracy at medium ranges. It needed to be effective against both unprotected personnel and those wearing body armor. And it needed to maintain the legendary reliability of the AK-47. In the sterile laboratories and cluttered workshops of the Soviet weapons development complex, engineers began experimenting with calibers. They tested 5mm rounds, 5.5mm, 6mm. They analyzed ballistics tables, conducted gel tests, and fired thousands of rounds into targets. Eventually, they settled on 5.45 by 39mm, a small, fast projectile that offered an ideal balance of characteristics. But the cartridge was only half the equation. Kalashnikov and his team now faced the challenge of adapting the AK-47 platform to handle this new, smaller round. Walk with me into the design bureau where this work unfolded. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp smell of gun oil. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting harsh illumination on drafting tables covered with blueprints and calculations. In the corner, partially assembled rifles lie on workbenches, metal parts gleaming under focused lamps. Kalashnikov, now in his late 40s, moves between workstations. His hands, scarred from decades of work, pick up components, examine them, set them down. His eyes, those are what strike you. They possess an intensity, a focus that seems to see through the metal to the very principles governing how the weapon will function. He doesn't just design rifles. He understands them the way a musician understands melody, intuitively and completely. The core challenge was managing recoil and muzzle rise. The 5.45mm cartridge, despite being smaller, generated significant muzzle velocity, 900 meters per second compared to the 7.62mm 715. This speed meant flatter trajectory and better accuracy, but it also created a sharp, aggressive recoil impulse that could throw off a shooter's aim during automatic fire. The solution came in the form of a redesigned muzzle brake. Picture this component, a precisely machined piece of steel attached to the end of the barrel, featuring angled ports that redirect propellant gases. When the rifle fires, those gases don't simply escape forward, they're channeled through the ports at specific angles, creating counterforces that dramatically reduce felt recoil and keep the muzzle down. It's elegant physics transformed into practical engineering. The team also refined the gas system. The AK platform had always used a long-stroke gas piston, a robust, reliable mechanism where expanding gases from fired rounds drive a piston that cycles the action, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. For the AK-74, they recalibrated this system for the new cartridge's characteristics, ensuring reliable cycling across the full range of environmental conditions. Testing was relentless and unforgiving. Prototypes were subjected to torture tests that would destroy lesser weapons. They were buried in sand, submerged in swamps, frozen in industrial freezers, then fired immediately. They were dropped from vehicles, thrown against walls, run over by trucks. Engineers recorded every malfunction, every failure, then returned to the workshop to refine, adjust, and improve. One particular test stands out in documented accounts. A prototype AK-74 was deliberately left outside during a Siberian winter night, fully exposed to the elements. By morning, ice had formed inside the receiver, coating the internal components. A tester picked up the frozen weapon, inserted a magazine, charged the bolt, which broke free the ice with an audible crack, and fired. The rifle performed flawlessly, emptying the entire magazine without a single stoppage. Magazine design also required attention. The new cartridge's different dimensions meant new magazines. The team developed lightweight polymer magazines that were both durable and distinctly recognizable by their reddish-brown color. These magazines could withstand drops onto concrete without cracking, could be left loaded for extended periods without spring fatigue, and featured reinforced feed lips that ensured reliable ammunition presentation to the bolt. Comment below with your thoughts on what aspect of weapons design you find most fascinating. Is it the engineering challenges, the testing process, or the tactical considerations that drive innovation? By 1973, the design was finalized. The AK-74 embodied everything Kalashnikov believed a military rifle should be: simple enough for a conscript to field strip and reassemble in darkness, reliable enough to function after being dragged through a muddy trench, accurate enough for effective fire at 300 meters, and powerful enough to neutralize threats wearing early body armor. It weighed just 3.4 kilograms unloaded, nearly a half kilogram lighter than the AK-47. Soldiers could carry 240 rounds of 5.45mm ammunition for the same weight as 120 rounds of 7.62mm. In 1974, after extensive field trials with select military units, the Soviet Army officially adopted the rifle. It was designated the Automat Kalashnikova Obraztsa 1974, Kalashnikov's automatic rifle, model 1974. The AK-74. The adoption of the AK-74 sent ripples through Western intelligence agencies. By the mid-1970s, the Cold War had settled into an uneasy equilibrium, but the arms race continued unabated. Every technological advancement by one side demanded assessment and response by the other. When reconnaissance reports and intelligence assets confirmed the Soviets were fielding a new small-caliber rifle, analysts took notice. In briefing rooms at the Pentagon and NATO headquarters, intelligence officers displayed grainy photographs of Soviet soldiers carrying rifles that looked similar to the AK-47 but featured distinct differences: a prominent muzzle brake, lighter-colored magazines, slightly different proportions. Ballistics experts were consulted. Reports from defectors were analyzed. Gradually, Western military establishments pieced together the specifications and implications of this new weapon. The timing was significant. The United States had fully committed to the M16 platform following its troubled introduction in Vietnam. Early models had suffered reliability issues. The rifle was sensitive to dirt and required meticulous maintenance, precisely the opposite of the AK-47's philosophy. But by the mid-70s, these problems had been largely resolved through improved materials, better ammunition, and design refinements. The M16A1 had proven itself as an effective combat rifle. The parallel evolution was striking. Both superpowers had reached similar conclusions through different paths. Both had recognized the advantages of intermediate cartridges and smaller calibers. Both had developed rifles optimized for the realities of modern combat rather than the romantic traditions of marksmanship at extended ranges. Yet their approaches remained philosophically distinct. The M16 emphasized precision and low weight, accepting tighter manufacturing tolerances and greater maintenance requirements in exchange for exceptional accuracy and minimal recoil. The AK-74 prioritized reliability and ease of use, maintaining loose tolerances and simple mechanisms that functioned in the worst conditions with minimal care. Neither approach was wrong, they simply reflected different military doctrines, different manufacturing capabilities, and different assumptions about the typical soldier's training level. Within the Soviet military, the AK-74's reception was overwhelmingly positive. Units that received the new rifles in the early to mid-70s reported significant advantages over the AK-47. Soldiers appreciated the reduced weight, which made long marches less exhausting and allowed them to carry more ammunition. The flatter trajectory meant hits at 300 meters required less holdover compensation. The reduced recoil allowed faster, more accurate follow-up shots. Marksmanship scores improved across the board. A conscript who might have struggled to control the AK-47 during automatic fire could now deliver effective bursts with the AK-74. The enhanced muzzle brake worked as designed, keeping the rifle remarkably flat even during sustained fire. Range instructors noted that soldiers achieved competency faster with the new weapon, a significant advantage for an army that relied heavily on conscription with relatively short service terms. The rifle also found favor with specialized units. Soviet paratroopers received a folding stock variant, the AK-74, with a side-folding metal stock that reduced overall length for jumping and vehicle transport, while maintaining full functionality when deployed. Spetsnaz units, Soviet Special Forces, appreciated the weapon's reliability and the increased ammunition load capacity for extended operations behind enemy lines. Beyond the Soviet Union, the AK-74 gradually spread throughout the Warsaw Pact and to Soviet client states. By the late 70s and early 80s, the distinctive rifles were appearing in the hands of East German soldiers, Polish troops, Bulgarian forces, and advisors in conflict zones across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Manufacturing licenses were granted to select allies, and production lines began turning out copies in multiple countries. Each military that adopted the rifle conducted its own evaluation. The consensus remained consistent. The AK-74 represented a meaningful advancement over its predecessor while maintaining the legendary reliability that had made the Kalashnikov platform globally dominant. It wasn't revolutionary in the way the original AK-47 had been, It was evolutionary, a refinement that took an already proven design and optimized it for a new generation of warfare. Western military observers acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness, even as they remained confident in their own platforms. The debate between the two approaches, Soviet simplicity versus Western precision, became a staple of military journals and war colleges. Officers argued passionately about which philosophy was superior, often without resolution. The truth, as is often the case, was more nuanced. Both weapons were excellent within their intended contexts, designed for different armies with different needs, different training systems, and different strategic assumptions. The true measure of any weapon system isn't found in laboratory tests or theoretical models. It's found in the dirt and chaos of actual combat, where lives hang in the balance and equipment failures mean death. For the AK-74, that proving ground came sooner than anyone anticipated. In December 1979, Soviet forces crossed the border into Afghanistan, beginning what would become a decade-long conflict that would test men and machines to their absolute limits. Afghanistan presented a unique and brutal operational environment. Picture the landscape: jagged mountain ranges where peaks soar above 5,000 meters, their slopes covered in loose scree and hidden caves. Narrow valleys where villages cling to impossible terrains. Deserts where daytime temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius and nighttime temperatures plummet below freezing. Soviet soldiers found themselves fighting in conditions that ranged from the sweltering lowlands to the frozen heights, often within the same operation. The Mujahideen fighters they faced were tough, resourceful, and intimately familiar with the terrain. They struck from ambush, disappeared into mountain strongholds, and fought with a ferocity born of defending their homeland. They were armed with a mixture of weapons, old British Lee Enfields, captured Soviet arms, and increasingly, weapons supplied by the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies. This wasn't conventional warfare. This was counterinsurgency in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. For the Soviet soldiers carrying AK-74s into those mountains, the rifle became more than equipment, it became a lifeline. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Antonovich, who served with a motorized rifle battalion in Panjshir Valley during 1982, later recounted his experience in an interview conducted years after the war. His words carried the weight of someone who trusted his life to his weapon in desperate circumstances. "We were conducting a sweep operation through a village suspected of harboring resistance fighters," Victor recalled, his voice steady but tinged with the distant echo of those days. "The intelligence was good, too good. We walked into an ambush at mid-morning. The shooting started from the buildings, from the hillside above us, from everywhere at once. My squad went to ground behind a low stone wall. I remember the sound of rounds impacting the stones, chips of rock flying into our faces." He paused, and when he continued, there was something in his tone, respect, perhaps, or gratitude. "My AK-74 had been with me for 8 months at that point. It had been dropped, covered in dust, soaked during a river crossing, never properly cleaned because we were always moving. In that moment, when I brought it up and returned fire, it worked perfectly. Magazine after magazine. We were in that firefight for nearly 2 hours before reinforcements arrived. My rifle never jammed, never hesitated. Some of my men were using older AK-47s. They worked too. Kalashnikov rifles always work, but you could see the difference. The 74 was flatter shooting, easier to control. When you're firing uphill at targets moving between rocks 300 meters away, that matters." Similar accounts emerged from across the conflict. The AK-74 proved itself in the thin air of high-altitude operations, where the reduced oxygen affected engine performance and human endurance but didn't impair the rifle's gas-operated mechanism. It functioned reliably after being carried through river crossings, after days of exposure to fine dust that infiltrated every piece of equipment, after the thermal shock of moving from heated vehicles into sub-zero exterior temperatures. The rifle's effectiveness wasn't just about reliability, it was about lethality. The 5.45mm cartridge, despite its small size, proved devastatingly effective in combat. The bullet was designed with a slightly offset center of gravity. Upon impact with tissue, it would yaw, tumble, creating massive temporary cavities and causing catastrophic trauma. At the velocities the AK-74 generated, the round was reliably lethal within its effective range. There's a documented engagement from 1984 that illustrates this point. A Spetsnaz team operating in Kunar province encountered a Mujahideen group near a mountain pass. The firefight occurred at ranges between 150 and 250 meters, precisely the engagement distances the AK-74 had been optimized for. The Spetsnaz team, numbering just 8 operators, engaged a force more than twice their size. The after-action report noted that the combination of superior training, tactical positioning, and the AK-74's accuracy and controllability allowed the outnumbered Soviet team to break contact successfully after neutralizing several opponents. Every Spetsnaz operator's rifle had functioned flawlessly despite the team having been in the field for 6 days without opportunity for detailed weapon maintenance. But Afghanistan wasn't the only theater where the AK-74 saw action during the 1980s. Soviet advisors deployed to various conflicts carried the weapon, and client states that had received the rifles put them to use. In the Ogaden War's later phases, in Angola, in various Middle Eastern conflicts, the distinctive profile of the AK-74 appeared in combat photographs and intelligence reports. Each environment provided its own test. The fine sand of desert environments is particularly challenging for firearms. It infiltrates every gap, mixes with lubricants to form an abrasive paste, and can cause rapid wear or jamming. Yet reports consistently indicated the AK-74 handled these conditions with the same resilience as its predecessor. The loose tolerances that Western engineers sometimes criticized as imprecise were, in fact, a deliberate design feature. Those tolerances allowed dirt, sand, and debris to pass through the action without binding the mechanism. One particularly telling incident occurred during training exercises in the Karakum Desert in 1983. A unit conducting live-fire maneuvers experienced a sudden sandstorm, the kind where visibility drops to mere meters and the air becomes an abrasive fog. Standard procedure would have been to cease fire, cover weapons, and seek shelter. Instead, as a practical test, the unit commander ordered them to continue the exercise. The soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces and continued engaging targets, while sand scoured everything exposed. When the storm passed and the weapons were inspected, they were caked with sand, their surfaces abraded, their actions gritty with dust. Yet, when the soldiers were ordered to clear and fire their weapons, every single AK-74 functioned. Some required additional force to charge the bolt initially, breaking free the accumulated grit, but once in operation, the gas system's power and the design's robust nature kept them running. It was an informal test, not conducted under laboratory conditions, but it reinforced what soldiers already knew: you could trust a Kalashnikov rifle when you couldn't trust anything else. The weapon's modular nature also proved advantageous in sustained operations. The AK-74 could be field stripped into its major components: receiver, bolt carrier, bolt, recoil spring, gas tube, in seconds without tools. A reasonably skilled soldier could swap parts between rifles, replacing a damaged component quickly even under field conditions. This ease of maintenance meant that units could maintain high operational readiness rates even when extended supply lines made factory repairs impractical. There were, of course, limitations. No weapon is perfect for every situation. At ranges beyond 400 meters, the small 5.45 mm projectile lost effectiveness compared to larger calibers. Its light weight made it more susceptible to wind drift at extended ranges. In open terrain where long-range engagements were common, soldiers sometimes wished for the greater reach of the old 7.62 mm cartridge or a designated marksman rifle. But these scenarios were relatively rare. The vast majority of combat engagements occurred exactly where the AK-74 was optimized, close to medium range, in varied terrain, under conditions that demanded reliability over precision. For those situations, which encompass perhaps 90% of actual combat encounters, the rifle was exceptional. As the Afghan war dragged on through the 80s, the legend of the AK-74 grew among Soviet forces. Soldiers developed an almost personal relationship with their weapons, the way warriors throughout history have named their swords or decorated their shields. They carved notches in wooden stocks, added unofficial modifications like improved slings or personal sighting marks, treated their rifles with a mixture of utilitarian practicality and superstitious reverence. When the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in February 1989, the soldiers carried their AK-74s back across the border. The rifles were worn, their finish abraded by years of hard use, their wooden furniture stained and scarred. But they still worked. They had been proven in the crucible of sustained combat, had demonstrated their worth in conditions that destroyed lesser equipment, had earned their place in the pantheon of great military firearms. Veterans returning home brought stories with them, stories of ambushes survived, of battles won, of moments when their lives had depended on the weapon in their hands not failing them. Those stories spread through the Soviet military, reinforcing what field testing had already suggested. Mikhail Kalashnikov had done it again. He had taken his proven design and evolved it for a new era, creating a weapon that balanced firepower, reliability, and practicality in proportions that were extraordinarily difficult to improve upon. Like this video if you're appreciating the detailed account of how battlefield reality tests theoretical design, and subscribe to explore more stories where engineering meets the ultimate crucible of combat. The AK-74 had proven itself not through marketing or propaganda, but through the most honest assessment possible. Soldiers who depended on it for survival consistently trusted it. That trust, earned round by round in the mountains of Afghanistan and deserts of Africa and jungles of various conflict zones, was the ultimate validation of Kalashnikov's design philosophy. By the late 1980s, the AK-74 had become the standard infantry rifle not just of the Soviet Union but of much of the Warsaw Pact. Yet Mikhail Kalashnikov understood a truth that many designers forget: evolution never stops. A weapon system that remains static becomes obsolete, no matter how good its original design. The operational feedback from Afghanistan and other conflicts provided valuable data for refinement and specialized variants. The first major evolution came with the development of the AK-74U, introduced in 1979. The U stood for Ukharachny, shortened. This carbine variant featured a significantly shorter barrel, just 210 mm compared to the standard 415, and a side-folding metal stock. It was designed specifically for vehicle crews, paratroopers, and special operations forces who needed a more compact weapon without sacrificing the Kalashnikov reliability. The AK-74U presented interesting engineering challenges. Shortening the barrel dramatically increased muzzle blast and flash, making the weapon less pleasant to shoot and potentially revealing the shooter's position at night. The development team addressed this with an expanded muzzle brake that not only reduced recoil but also partially suppressed the muzzle flash. The result was a weapon that, despite its compact dimensions, remained controllable and effective at ranges up to 200 meters, perfectly adequate for its intended roles. Special Forces units quickly adopted the shortened variant. Its compact size made it ideal for operations in urban environments, for teams operating from vehicles, for airborne insertions where every centimeter of length matters when exiting an aircraft. The trade-off in effective range was acceptable because special operations typically involved close-quarters engagements where the AK-74U's maneuverability was more valuable than long-range precision. Parallel to these variants, the Soviets developed the RPK-74, a light machine gun variant of the AK-74. It featured a longer, heavier barrel for sustained fire, a bipod for stability, and was typically fed from either 45-round magazines or 60-round drums. This weapon filled the squad automatic weapon role, providing suppressive fire with the same 5.45mm cartridge used by the rifleman, which simplified logistics since the entire squad used the same ammunition. The modularity of the AK-74 platform meant that components were largely interchangeable between variants. A rifleman could, in an emergency, use magazines from the RPK-74. Parts could be swapped between the standard rifle and the shortened carbine. This interoperability at the unit level was a significant logistical advantage, reducing the burden on supply chains and allowing field repairs using available components. As the 1990s dawned and the Soviet Union collapsed, the AK-74 faced an uncertain future. The newly independent Russian Federation inherited the Soviet military's equipment and the state factories that produced it. Economic chaos threatened weapons production. But the rifle was too well established, too proven, and too integral to Russian military doctrine to abandon. Instead, development continued. The AK-74M, introduced in the early 2000s, represented a comprehensive modernization of the basic design. It featured a side-folding polymer stock that was more durable than wood and less prone to warping from moisture. The rifle incorporated mounting rails for optical sights, laser designators, and tactical lights, acknowledgement that modern infantry combat increasingly involved night operations and precision engagement using electronic optics. These modernization efforts reflected broader trends in small arms development. The era of iron sights and fixed stocks was giving way to modular weapon systems where individual soldiers could configure their rifles for specific missions. The AK-74M could mount various optical sights from simple red dots for close quarters to more sophisticated scopes for designated marksman roles, all while maintaining the core reliability that had always been the Kalashnikov platform's defining characteristic. Other nations that had adopted the AK-74 developed their own variants. Bulgaria produced the AK-74 series under license with minor modifications. Poland developed the Tantal, their version incorporating subtle improvements based on Polish military requirements. East Germany, before reunification, had begun producing their own variant. Even after the Cold War's end, production continued in various forms across multiple countries. The rifle also inspired derivatives in other calibers. Some nations that appreciated the AK-74's design but already had established logistics for different ammunition developed versions chambered in 5.56 NATO or other cartridges, grafting the proven Kalashnikov mechanism onto different ballistic platforms. Mikhail Kalashnikov himself continued working well into his later years, consulting on new designs and modifications. He became a living legend, awarded countless honors, including Hero of the Russian Federation. Interestingly, despite his weapons being used in conflicts worldwide, Kalashnikov maintained that he designed them for defense of his homeland, not for the violence that sometimes employed them. In interviews, he spoke more like an engineer proud of solving a difficult problem than a warrior glorifying combat. He passed away in December 2013 at the age of 94. Leaving behind a legacy measured not just in rifles produced but in the fundamental influence his design philosophy had on military small arms worldwide. The AK-74's legacy extends beyond its direct variants. Its existence influenced Western designs, proving that the intermediate cartridge concept the M16 had pioneered had been validated by Soviet adoption. It demonstrated that reliability and simplicity remained crucial even as technology advanced. Modern rifle designs, whether the American M4, the German HK-416, or countless others, reflect lessons that the AK-74 embodied. Soldiers need weapons that work under the worst conditions, that can be maintained with minimal resources, that balance accuracy with controllability. Today, decades after its introduction, the AK-74 and its variants remain in frontline service with Russian military forces and numerous other nations. Modern Russian soldiers carry the AK-12, the latest evolution of Kalashnikov's concept, but the DNA of the AK-74 is clearly visible in its design. Conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and Ukraine have seen the AK-74 continuing to prove its worth, still functioning reliably in environments that challenge even the most advanced modern equipment. Perhaps most remarkably, the rifle has achieved something rare in military equipment. It has remained relevant across multiple generations of warfare. Introduced before personal computers were common, before the internet, before the digital revolution transformed military operations, the AK-74 continues to serve in an era of drone warfare, cyber operations, and network-centric combat. That longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of its design, a design rooted not in technological complexity, but in deep understanding of what soldiers actually need in combat. As evening light fades over a military range somewhere in present-day Russia, a young soldier raises an AK-74 to her shoulder. The rifle she holds might have been manufactured last year or 30 years ago, With proper maintenance, both work identically. She aims at a target 300 meters downrange, controls her breathing as instructors have taught for generations, and squeezes the trigger. The familiar crack echoes across the range. The target falls. The rifle has performed exactly as Mikhail Kalashnikov intended when he designed it over 4 decades ago. This is the ultimate legacy of the AK-74, not just that it works, but that it continues working, that its design philosophy remains valid across technological generations, that soldiers separated by decades of time can pick up the weapon and immediately understand its operation because its logic is intuitive and universal. The story of the AK-74 is fundamentally a story about design philosophy, about what happens when someone understands not just the technical requirements of a problem but the human factors that surround it. Kalashnikov designed his rifles for conscripts who might have only basic training, for conditions that would destroy more delicate equipment, for situations where complexity becomes liability and simplicity becomes survival. This philosophy stands in interesting contrast to much of modern technological development, which often prioritizes features over fundamentals, complexity over reliability. The AK-74 reminds us that sometimes the best solution to a problem is not the most sophisticated one, but the one that works consistently under the worst conditions. It's a lesson,